In the unforgiving Dakota Territory of 1876, 22-year-old Seraphina Manning was cast into the Badlands for refusing Sheriff Cornelius Blackwood's twisted demands, left to die among the rattlesnakes and scorching sun until a Lakota warrior named Mato Najin found her broken body and gave her not just a second chance at life, but a new name, a new purpose, and a love that would challenge everything the frontier thought it knew about civilization.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Deadwood Gulch, where the smell of horse manure mixed with the acrid smoke from the copper mines that had built this godforsaken town from nothing but greed and desperation. Seraphina Manning stood behind the counter of Manning's General Store, her delicate fingers arranging bolts of calico and cotton with the same precision her mother had taught her, before consumption took her 3 winters past, at 22. Sera possessed the kind of beauty that made men stupid and women jealous, with auburn hair that caught fire in the lamplight and emerald eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. But in Deadwood Gulch, beauty was both a blessing and a curse, and Sera had learned early that the wrong kind of attention could destroy a woman faster than any bullet. The bell above the door chimed with the deliberate slowness of someone who owned the world, and Sera's stomach tightened as Sheriff Cornelius Blackwood filled the doorway like a thundercloud. Blackwood was a man who wore authority like an ill-fitting suit, his badge polished to a mirror shine while his soul remained as tarnished as week-old silver. He was 43 years old, with graying temples and hands that had never known honest work, having clawed his way to power through a combination of political connections back east and a willingness to look the other way when the mine owners needed problems to disappear. His pale blue eyes moved over Sera with the calculating hunger of a man who believed everything in his territory belonged to him, including the women. Miss Manning. Blackwood's voice was silk over steel as he removed his hat, revealing hair slicked back with pomade that smelled of cheap cologne and expensive whiskey. I trust you've had time to consider my proposition. He spoke the word proposition like it was something sacred, though they both knew it was anything but holy. The floorboards creaked under his weight as he approached the counter, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Behind him, his Deputy Marcus Drummond lurked like a faithful dog, one hand resting on his gun butt in a gesture that was meant to look casual, but felt like a threat. Sera's father, Thomas Manning, emerged from the back room carrying a crate of canned goods, his weathered face going pale when he saw their visitors. At 58, Thomas had the look of a man who'd worked hard all his life only to discover that honest labor meant nothing when corrupt men held the power. His hands shook slightly as he set down the crate, and Sera noticed the way his shoulders seemed to bow under an invisible weight. The store that had been in the Manning family for 15 years was failing, not because of lack of customers, but because certain influential people had made it clear that shopping at Manning's might not be in a person's best interest. Sheriff, Thomas nodded, his voice carefully neutral. What brings you by this morning? But they all knew why Blackwood was here. For 3 months, he'd been circling Sera like a vulture, making his intentions clear with every lingering look and unwanted touch. The proposition he'd made a week ago had been delivered with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Become his mistress, and the Manning family would find themselves under his protection. Refuse, and well, accidents happened in mining towns, especially to families who couldn't afford to fight back. Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth as he leaned against the counter, close enough that Sera could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. I've been thinking about our conversation, Miss Manning. About the future of your family's establishment. He gestured around the store with a proprietary air, as if he already owned everything in sight. These are dangerous times for small business owners. Why, just last week, the Fletcher family store burned down under mysterious circumstances. Tragic, really, especially with winter coming on. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, subtle enough to deny, but clear enough to understand. Sierra's hands clenched into fists beneath the counter, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. She'd heard about the Fletcher fire, seen the family loading their possessions into a wagon and leaving town with their dreams reduced to ash and charred timber. Everyone knew it hadn't been an accident, just as everyone knew that asking too many questions about such things was a quick way to join the Fletcher family in their exodus. Now, I'm a reasonable man, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a slow child. I understand that a young woman like yourself might have certain reservations about accepting my offer, but I think you'll find that my protection comes with considerable benefits. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, setting it on the counter between them like a chess piece. This belonged to my dear departed wife, God rest her soul. Sapphires from San Francisco, worth more than this entire store. Thomas Manning's face went ashen as he recognized the box. Everyone in Deadwood Gulch knew the story of Margaret Blackwood, the sheriff's wife who died under mysterious circumstances 2 years ago. The official story was that she'd fallen down the stairs in a tragic accident, but the unofficial whispers spoke of bruises that couldn't be explained away and a woman who'd grown increasingly desperate to escape her husband's tender mercies. The fact that Blackwood was now offering her jewelry to another woman felt like a desecration, a sign that he viewed women as interchangeable possessions rather than human beings with their own hopes and dreams. I don't want your dead wife's jewelry, Sierra said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. And I don't want your protection. I want you to leave my family alone. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and she saw Deputy Drummond's hand move closer to his gun. But Sierra had inherited her father's stubborn streak along with her mother's beauty, and she'd be damned if she'd let herself be bought and sold like cattle in the marketplace of corrupt men's desires. Blackwood's expression shifted from predatory charm to something much darker, his pale eyes going cold as winter ice. I think you misunderstand the nature of our situation, Miss Manning. This isn't a negotiation. This is me being generous enough to offer you a choice. He picked up the velvet box and snapped it shut with a sound like breaking bones. You see, your father here has been having some difficulty with his taxes. Seems there's been a significant miscalculation in what he owes the territory. That's not possible, Thomas protested, stepping forward despite his fear. I've paid every cent I owe, and I have the receipts to prove it. But even as he spoke, Sierra could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. In a town where the law was whatever Sheriff Blackwood said it was, receipts and honest dealing meant nothing if the wrong person decided they wanted something you had. Papers can be lost. Blackwood shrugged, his tone suggesting that such things happened all the time. Records can be misplaced. And when that happens, well, the law requires that outstanding debts be settled immediately. I calculate that the Manning family owes approximately, let's see, $3,000 in back taxes and penalties. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $3,000 was more money than the store made in 2 years, an impossible sum that might as well have been 3 million. Sierra felt the world tilt beneath her feet as the true scope of Blackwood's trap revealed itself. This wasn't just about his twisted desire for her. It was about complete control, about demonstrating to the entire town that no one was beyond his reach. The mine owners who really ran Deadwood Gulch had taught him well. The best way to control people wasn't through violence, though that had its place, but through debt and legal technicalities that made resistance seem hopeless. However, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on a magnanimous tone that made Sierra's skin crawl. I'm prepared to overlook this unfortunate situation in exchange for certain ... considerations. Miss Manning, you would take up residence in my home as my personal
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Companion. Your father's debts would be forgiven, and the Manning family would find themselves under my official protection. It's really quite generous when you think about it. The silence that followed was deafening. Through the store's front window, Sierra could see the normal life of Deadwood Gulch continuing. Women hanging laundry, children playing in the dust, men heading to their shifts at the mine. None of them knew that in this moment, her entire world was crumbling around her. She thought of her mother, who died believing that her daughter would find happiness and love in this harsh land. She thought of her father, who'd worked himself to the bone trying to build something decent in a place where decency was a luxury few could afford. "I need time to think," Sierra said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a stalling tactic, and they all knew it, but she desperately needed space to breathe, to figure out if there was any way out of this trap that wouldn't destroy everything she held dear. Blackwood's smile was the expression of a man who'd just won a game he'd been playing for months. "Of course, my dear. Such an important decision shouldn't be rushed. But I'm afraid I can't give you too much time to deliberate. The territorial tax inspector is scheduled to arrive next week, and once he files his report, well, let's just say that bureaucracy has a way of making problems much more complicated." After Blackwood and his deputy left, the store felt haunted by their presence. Thomas Manning sank into a chair behind the counter, his face buried in his hands as the weight of their situation settled over him like a shroud. Sierra moved to the window and stared out at the dusty street, watching the people of Deadwood Gulch go about their daily lives, unaware that one of their own was drowning in the quicksand of corruption and greed. "Papa," she said softly, turning back to face her father. "How bad is it really?" She already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it spoken aloud, needed to understand the exact dimensions of the cage that was closing around them. Thomas looked up at her with eyes that had aged 10 years in the past hour, and she saw the defeat there, the recognition that honest men didn't win against corrupt systems, were ruined. "Sierra," he said quietly, "even if we could somehow prove that his claims about the taxes are false, who would believe us? He owns the courthouse, the judge, half the town council. And even if we could fight him legally, we don't have the money for lawyers or the time to wait for justice that might never come." His voice cracked on the last words, and Sierra felt her heart break for this good man who'd tried so hard to build something decent in an indecent world. That night, as her father slept fitfully in the room above the store, Sierra sat by the window and stared out at the star-filled sky. The Badlands stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders, a harsh landscape that claimed the lives of travelers who underestimated its dangers. She'd heard stories of people who'd wandered into that wasteland and never returned, their bones picked clean by vultures and scattered by the wind. It seemed fitting somehow that such a place existed at the edge of a town where corruption flourished like weeds in untended soil. She thought about her mother's letters, carefully preserved in a wooden box under her bed. Margaret Manning had written to her sister back east about the challenges of frontier life, but also about the hope that sustained her through the hardest times. "We came here to build something better," one letter read, "not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will follow. This land may be harsh, but it's also honest. It doesn't lie to you about what it is or what it costs to survive here." If only the same could be said about the people who'd claimed dominion over it. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the certainty that today would change everything. Sierra dressed carefully in her best blue dress, the one her mother had sewn for her 18th birthday, and braided her auburn hair with hands that trembled despite her attempts to remain calm. If she was going to face the devil, she would do it with dignity, refusing to let him see how thoroughly he'd cornered her. The store was busy that morning, filled with customers who seemed to sense that something momentous was about to happen. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, lingered over her selection of fabric longer than necessary, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. Young Billy Patterson, who usually burst into the store with boyish enthusiasm, seemed subdued as he counted out coins for his mother's shopping list. Even the air itself felt charged with anticipation, as if the very atoms knew that the established order was about to be shattered. When Blackwood arrived at precisely 11 o'clock, he brought with him an entourage that made his intentions clear. Deputy Drummond flanked his right side, while Tax Assessor Williams took position on his left. Behind them stood two of Blackwood's unofficial enforcers, men whose names were whispered in the town's darker corners. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't a social call, but an execution, Miss Manning. Blackwood's voice carried the authority of a man who'd never been denied anything he truly wanted. I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my generous offer. He removed his hat with theatrical courtesy, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. The other customers in the store began to drift toward the door. Recognizing the signs of impending violence that hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, Sarah stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance that she didn't entirely feel. I have considered it, Sheriff, and my answer is no. The words came out stronger than she'd expected, carrying the weight of her mother's courage and her father's integrity. I will not be bought, sold, or coerced into becoming your mistress. If you want to destroy my family over fabricated tax debts, then do it. But I will not trade my dignity for your protection. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the flies that buzzed around the store's ceiling seemed to pause in their endless circling. Blackwood's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, admiration, and finally, a cold fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop by 10 degrees. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the menace of a rattlesnake's warning. Very well, Miss Manning. You've made your choice, and now you'll live with the consequences. Thomas Manning, you are under arrest for tax evasion and fraud. Your property is hereby seized by the territorial government, and you will be held in custody until such time as your debts are settled. He nodded to his deputies, who moved toward Thomas with the efficiency of men who'd performed this dance many times before. Wait, Sarah's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. If I agree to your terms, what happens to my father? It was a desperate gambit, a last attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her life. But Blackwood's smile told her that he'd been expecting this moment, had orchestrated every detail of their conversation to lead to this precise point. Your father would be released immediately, of course. All charges dropped, all debts forgiven. He could even keep the store, though I imagine he'd want to find a new location. Deadwood Gulch can be quite harsh on those who fall from grace. The threat was delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed his power, who fed on the fear and desperation of others. Sarah closed her eyes and thought of her mother, of the woman who'd believed that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right, despite being afraid. When she opened them again, her voice was steady and clear. I agree to your terms, Sheriff, but I want it in writing, signed and witnessed, that my father's debts are completely forgiven and that he's free to leave town without any interference from you or your men. Blackwood's triumph was evident in every line of his body as he produced a prepared document from his coat pocket. Already taken care of, my dear. Though I must insist on one small modification to our arrangement. His smile became predatory as he continued. I've decided that our partnership would be better served if we were to take a little trip together. There's a cabin in the Badlands where we can get to know each other better, away from the prying eyes of the townspeople. The wagon ride into the Badlands felt like a journey into hell itself. Sarah sat beside Blackwood on the driver's bench, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the harsh landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering mirage that made Distant buttes looked like ships floating on an invisible sea. Behind them, Deputy Drummond rode alongside two other men, their presence a constant reminder that escape was impossible. "You know," Blackwood said conversationally, as if they were taking a pleasant Sunday drive, "I've always admired your spirit, Miss Manning." Most women would have accepted my offer immediately, understanding the benefits of aligning themselves with power. But you had to make things difficult. His tone was almost affectionate, but Sarah could hear the underlying menace in his words. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a ramshackle structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were boarded up with rough planks that had been weathered gray by the relentless sun and wind. It was the kind of place where screams would go unheard and secrets would be buried with the bleached bones of desert creatures. "Welcome to your new home," Blackwood said with mock gallantry as he helped her down from the wagon. "I think you'll find it quite private." The way he said the word made Sarah's blood run cold, but she forced herself to remain calm. If she was going to survive this, she needed to be smart, to look for opportunities rather than surrender to despair. As the sun began to set, painting the Badlands in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Sarah found herself alone with Blackwood in the cabin's main room. The other men had made camp outside, their voices drifting through the thin walls as they shared bottles of whiskey and told crude jokes about their boss's latest acquisition. "Now then," Blackwood said, removing his coat and hanging it on a wooden peg, "I think it's time we discuss the terms of our arrangement in more detail." He moved toward her with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards, who'd never encountered a situation he couldn't control through force or intimidation. But as he reached for her, Sarah's hand closed around the heavy iron poker that had been lying beside the cold fireplace. The blow caught him across the temple, and he stumbled backward with a cry of pain and surprise. Blood trickled down his face as he stared at her in disbelief, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "You little wildcat," he snarled, his carefully maintained facade of civility finally cracking. "I was going to be gentle with you, but now ... His words were cut off as Sarah swung the poker again, catching him in the ribs with a satisfying crack. What followed was a desperate struggle in the cramped confines of the cabin. Blackwood was stronger, but Sarah had desperation on her side, and the fury of a woman who'd been pushed beyond her breaking point. She managed to get past him and burst through the cabin door, but the deputies were waiting outside, their guns drawn and pointed at her heart. "Going somewhere, Miss Manning?" Deputy Drummond's voice carried a note of amusement, as if he'd been expecting this development. "I'm afraid the sheriff's hospitality doesn't extend to allowing guests to wander off into the desert, especially not guests who've shown such ingratitude for his generosity." Behind him, Blackwood emerged from the cabin, his face bloody but his eyes blazing with a cold fury that promised terrible retribution. "Tie her up," Blackwood ordered, his voice rough with pain and rage. "And gag her. I don't want to hear any more of her protests." As the deputies moved to obey, he leaned close to Sarah's ear and whispered, "You should have taken the easy way, my dear. Now you're going to learn what happens to women who forget their place in the natural order of things." The rope burned against Sarah's wrists as she struggled against her bonds, the coarse hemp drawing blood that trickled down her fingers and stained the rough wooden floor of the cabin. The gag in her mouth tasted of dust and desperation, muffling her attempts to breathe steadily through her nose as panic clawed at her throat like a living thing. Through the boarded windows, she could hear the deputies settling in for the night, their voices growing louder and more slurred as they passed bottles of rot-gut whiskey between them, like communion, wine in some unholy ritual. Sheriff Blackwood sat in the cabin's only chair, methodically cleaning the blood from his temple with a damp cloth while his pale eyes never left her face. The friendly mask he'd worn in town had been completely discarded, revealing the predator that had always lurked beneath the surface of his carefully constructed respectability. His shirt was torn where she'd caught him with the poker, and she could see the purple bruise spreading across his ribs like spilled ink on paper. "You know," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than her imminent violation. "I've broken a lot of spirited fillies in my time. The trick is knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, and when to ease off before you snap something important." He folded the bloody cloth with deliberate precision and set it aside, then reached for a bottle of whiskey that sat on the crude table beside him. "Your mother, for instance, had spirit once, before she learned the futility of fighting against the inevitable." The words hit Sierra like a physical blow, and she felt her world tilt sideways as the implications crashed over her. Her mother had never mentioned knowing Blackwood before the family moved to Deadwood Gulch, but now she could see the truth in his satisfied expression. Margaret Manning hadn't died of consumption in some distant city. She died here in this godforsaken place, after encountering the man who now held her daughter captive. "Oh yes," Blackwood continued, noting her shocked expression with evident pleasure. "Sweet Margaret. She was even more beautiful than you are now, if such a thing is possible, and just as stubborn about accepting the natural order of things." He took a long pull from the bottle, his eyes growing distant with memory. "She fought me for months, that one did. Made all sorts of threats about telling her husband, about leaving town, about writing to relatives back east, but in the end, she came to understand that resistance was pointless." The cabin seemed to spin around Sierra as she processed this revelation. Her mother's final months, the way she'd grown increasingly withdrawn and fragile, the mysterious cough that had seemed to come from nowhere and consume her from the inside out, it all made horrible sense now. Margaret Manning hadn't died from disease. She died from the slow poison of powerlessness, from having her spirit crushed by the same man who now threatened to destroy her daughter. "She was carrying my child when she died," Blackwood added with casual cruelty, as if he were discussing the price of grain rather than the destruction of a family. "A pity, really. I would have enjoyed having a son to carry on my legacy. But these things happen, especially to women who insist on making their lives more difficult than necessary." He stood up from his chair with the lazy grace of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run outside. The deputies' voices had grown quieter as the night deepened, punctuated by the occasional burst of drunken laughter or the clink of bottles being passed from hand to hand. Sierra could smell the smoke from their campfire drifting through the gaps in the cabin walls, carrying with it the aroma of beans and bacon that made her empty stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the stress of the day had left her feeling hollow and disconnected from her own body. Blackwood began to unbutton his shirt with deliberate slowness, his movements calculated to maximize her terror rather than satisfy any genuine desire. This wasn't about lust, she realized. It was about power, about demonstrating his complete control over her body and her fate. The way he watched her face as he disrobed told her that her fear was as important to him as any physical conquest. "I want you to understand something, Miss Manning," he said as he hung his shirt on the back of his chair. "What happens here tonight is going to happen whether you fight or not. The only question is how much pain you experience in the process." His chest was pale and soft, the body of a man who'd never done honest work, marked now by the spreading bruise where her poker had found its mark. "I can be gentle, even considerate, if you show the proper appreciation for my generosity." The sound of glass breaking outside interrupted his monologue, followed by cursing and the sound of boots on rocky ground. One of the deputies had apparently knocked over a bottle in his drunken stupor, and the resulting argument between him and his companions provided a momentary distraction. Blackwood moved to the window and peered through a gap in the boards, his attention focused on the chaos in the camp. It was the opportunity Sierra had been waiting for. With her hands tied behind her back, she couldn't reach the bonds directly, But she'd noticed that one of the wooden floorboards near the wall was loose, its edge worn smooth by years of weather and neglect. If she could work her way over to it and rub the rope against that sharp edge, she might be able to weaken her bonds enough to break free. The process was agonizing. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her arms and shoulders, and the rough wood of the floor scraped against her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. But desperation gave her strength, and she managed to position herself so that the rope was grinding against the board's edge with each subtle movement of her wrists. "Idiots," Blackwood muttered, turning back from the window. "I'm surrounded by complete." He stopped mid-sentence as he noticed that she'd moved from her original position. His eyes narrowed as he took in the rope fibers scattered on the floor around the loose board, and his face darkened with fury. Clever girl. But not clever enough. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and hauled her upright by her hair, ignoring her muffled cry of pain as he examined the partially severed rope. The hemp was more than half cut through, and another few minutes of work would have freed her completely. His grip tightened until tears streamed down her cheeks, and she could feel individual strands of hair pulling loose from her scalp. "You just don't learn, do you?" He snarled, his breath hot against her ear. "Very well. If you want to play games, we'll play games. But I promise you won't enjoy the rules." He dragged her to the center of the room and forced her to her knees, then began wrapping a new length of rope around her ankles with vicious efficiency. "There, now let's see you try any more of your tricks." What followed was the longest night of Sierra's life. Blackwood seemed to take perverse pleasure in drawing out her torment, alternating between casual conversation and sudden bursts of violence that left her reeling and disoriented. He talked about his plans for her future, about the special room he'd prepared in his house where she would live as his private collection piece, about the children she would bear him and the proper way to raise them in submission to his will. "You'll come to appreciate the certainty of it all," he said as he paced around her like a circling wolf. "No more worrying about money or social position or any of the 1,000 little anxieties that plague ordinary people. Your only concern will be pleasing me, and I'll make sure you understand exactly what that requires." He paused in front of her and tilted her chin up with one finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Your mother learned to find peace in surrender. Eventually, you will too." But even as he spoke, Sierra could see something in his eyes that gave her hope uncertainty. For all his talk of breaking her spirit, he seemed frustrated by her continued resistance. Every time he expected her to crumble, she found some new reserve of strength, some deeper well of defiance that surprised even her. She was discovering that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The sound of movement outside grew quieter as the night wore on, and eventually, the deputies' voices faded into the drunken snores of men who'd consumed far more whiskey than their bodies could handle. Blackwood had grown increasingly agitated as the hours passed, his carefully controlled demeanor cracking under the strain of her stubborn refusal to break. He'd expected tears, pleas for mercy, desperate bargaining, not this quiet, burning resistance that seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. "Enough," he said finally, his voice rough with frustration and whiskey. "I've wasted enough time on your theatrics. It's time you learned what happens to women who forget their place in the natural order." He began unbuckling his belt with movements that were sharp and angry rather than seductive. "I was going to be gentle with you, but you've made it clear that you don't appreciate kindness." The leather belt hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot, and Sierra felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized that her time had finally run out. All her struggles, all her defiance, had led to this moment when she would finally learn the true cost of refusing to submit to power. But even as terror threatened to overwhelm her, she found herself thinking of her mother, of the woman who'd died rather than surrender her dignity to this monster. "Wait," Sierra managed to say around the gag, the word coming out as a desperate mumble. She'd been working at the cloth with her tongue for hours, and she'd finally managed to loosen it enough to speak, though the effort left her mouth dry and her jaw aching. Please. I need to tell you something important. Blackwood paused. In his undressing, his pale eyes suspicious but intrigued. What could you possibly have to say that would interest me now? But his curiosity was stronger than his caution, and he reached over to pull the gag from her mouth. Make it quick. I'm not in the mood for any more of your games. Sierra worked her jaw carefully, trying to restore feeling to her numb lips while her mind raced through the only plan she had left. It was desperate, probably suicidal, but it was the only card she had left to play. My father, he has money hidden away. Gold coins buried under the store. Enough to pay off the taxes you claim he owes, and more besides. Liar, Blackwood said flatly, but she could see the flicker of interest in his eyes. If your father had that kind of money, why would he let his store fail? Why would he let his daughter be brought to this place? But even as he spoke, she could see him calculating, weighing the possibility that she might be telling the truth. Because he doesn't trust banks, Sierra said, improvising frantically. He lived through the panic of '73, saw good men lose everything when the banks failed. So he's been hoarding gold ever since, buying it whenever he could and hiding it where no one would think to look. She let desperation creep into her voice, making it sound like a genuine confession rather than a fabrication. He made me promise never to tell anyone, not even under the worst circumstances. But I can't let this happen. Blackwood's expression shifted as he processed this information. $3,000 in gold would solve more than just the Manning family's problems. It would give him the resources to expand his power base, to buy the loyalty of men who currently served him only out of fear. And if the gold was real, then keeping Sierra alive long enough to lead him to it would be a far better investment than satisfying his immediate desires. How much? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. And don't lie to me, girl. I'll know if you're trying to deceive me. He moved closer, his eyes boring into hers as if he could read the truth written on her soul. Because if you're playing me for a fool, what I had planned for tonight will seem like a gentle caress compared to what I'll do to you. $5,000, Sierra said, choosing a number large enough to be tempting but not so large as to be unbelievable. Maybe more. He never told me the exact amount, but I've seen the bags when he thought I wasn't looking. Heavy canvas sacks that clinked when he moved them. She let her voice break slightly, as if the confession was being torn from her against her will. Please. If I tell you where it is, will you let me go? Will you let my father live? Blackwood stared at her for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the implications of her revelation. $5,000 was serious money, enough to buy a small ranch or establish a business in a larger city. More importantly, it was money that could be used to consolidate his power in ways that mere political influence couldn't achieve. But it was also money that was currently buried somewhere in Deadwood Gulch, guarded by nothing more than an old man's secrecy. You're lying, he said finally, but there was less conviction in his voice than there had been moments before. If your father had that kind of money, he would have used it to buy his way out of trouble long ago. He wouldn't have let his daughter be brought to this place just to protect some buried treasure. You don't know my father, Sierra said, allowing real emotion to creep into her voice. He's a stubborn man, proud to a fault. He'd rather die than admit he's been hiding money from the tax collectors. And he'd rather sacrifice his daughter than betray what he sees as his sacred duty to preserve the family's future. The words tasted like poison in her mouth, but she could see they were having an effect on Blackwood's calculations. Even if what you're saying is true, he continued, beginning to pace around her again. Why should I trust you to lead me to it? What's to stop you from running the moment we reach town, or crying for help, or simply refusing to cooperate? He stopped directly in front of her, his pale eyes glittering with a combination of greed and suspicion. "You've already proven that you can't be trusted to keep your word, because I want to live," Sira said simply. "Because I want my father to live. Because I've seen what happens to women who try to fight you, and I'm not strong enough to end up like my mother." She let her shoulders slump in apparent defeat, projecting the image of a woman who'd finally been broken by the weight of impossible circumstances. "I'll take you to the gold, and I'll make sure my father cooperates. But I want your word that once you have it, you'll let us leave town alive." Blackwood's smile was sharp and predatory, but she could see the greed burning behind his eyes like a fever. "My word? You want the word of a man you've been calling a monster and a murderer?" He laughed, a sound like broken glass grinding underfoot. "Very well, Miss Manning. You have my word that once I have the gold, I'll allow you and your father to leave Deadwood Gulch alive. Though I make no promises about what condition you'll be in when you go. I need more than that." Sira pressed, sensing that she had him hooked, and knowing that she had to negotiate the best terms possible while he was still interested in her story. "I need your word that you won't hurt my father, that you won't touch me until after we've recovered the gold, and that you'll provide us with a wagon and supplies for the journey out of town. You're in no position to make demands." Blackwood snarled, but his anger seemed automatic rather than genuine. She could see him calculating the costs and benefits of her proposal, weighing his immediate desires against the potential for long-term gain. "But I suppose I can afford to be generous, given the circumstances." "Very well, you have my word on all those conditions, with one addition: if you're lying to me about the gold. If this is some elaborate scheme to escape or cause trouble, then our original arrangement stands. And I promise you that what I do to you afterward will make tonight's activities seem like a pleasant dream." Dawn was breaking over the Badlands when Blackwood finally cut her bonds and allowed her to stand on unsteady legs. The circulation had been cut off to her hands and feet for so long that the return of sensation was almost as painful as the rope burns that ringed her wrists like bloody bracelets. She rubbed her arms gingerly, trying to restore feeling to her numb fingers while her mind raced through the next phase of her desperate plan. The deputies were roused from their drunken stupor with kicks and curses, their hangovers making them surly and dangerous as they prepared for the ride back to town. Deputy Drummond kept glancing at Sira with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, clearly wondering why she was still alive when their boss had made his intentions so clear the night before. But Blackwood offered no explanations, simply ordering them to break camp and prepare for immediate departure. "Remember," he said quietly as he helped her onto the wagon seat, his grip on her arm tight enough to leave bruises, "you're going to smile and act like everything is perfectly normal when we reach town. Any attempt to signal for help, any deviation from our agreement, and your father dies before you can draw your next breath." His voice was soft and conversational, but she could hear the absolute certainty in it. "I've killed men for far less than what you've put me through tonight." The ride back to Deadwood Gulch felt like a journey through purgatory. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail, and Sira's torn dress provided little protection against the burning rays. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst, and her head pounded from the combination of dehydration and the stress of maintaining her deception. But she forced herself to sit straight and keep her expression neutral, knowing that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by the predators who surrounded her as they approached the outskirts of town. Sira could see the familiar landmarks of her childhood, the church steeple reaching toward the sky like a finger pointing at heaven, the water tower that supplied the mines with the liquid they needed to wash gold from rock, the neat rows of houses where respectable families tried to build decent lives in an indecent world. Everything looked the same, but she knew that she was no longer the same person who'd left this place less than 24 hours ago. "There," Blackwood said, pointing toward the general store that had been her family's livelihood for as long as she could remember. I hope for your sake that your father is in a cooperative mood this morning. Because if he gives me any trouble, if he tries to deny what you've told me, then our agreement becomes null and void." He turned to face her fully, his pale eyes burning with anticipation. "Are you ready to collect on your family's hidden treasure, Miss Manning?" Sierra took a deep breath and nodded, praying that her father would be smart enough to play along with whatever story she was about to tell him. The next few hours would determine whether her desperate gambit would save their lives or simply delay their inevitable destruction. But as the wagon rolled down the dusty main street of Deadwood Gulch, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was fragile and probably foolish, but it was enough to keep her fighting for just a little longer. The bell above Manning's General Store chimed with the same cheerful tone it had for 15 years, but the sound felt like a death knell as Sierra stepped through the doorway with Sheriff Blackwood's hand gripping her elbow like a steel manacle. Her father looked up from behind the counter where he'd been mechanically sorting through invoices, his weathered face going pale when he saw her torn dress and the rope burns that marked her wrists like stigmata. The questions in his eyes were desperate and heartbreaking, but she couldn't answer them directly, not with Blackwood's deputies, positioning themselves at strategic points around the store like wolves surrounding wounded prey. "Papa," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled despite the chaos of emotions churning in her chest. "I need to tell Sheriff Blackwood about the special savings account you've been keeping." She emphasized the words in a way that she prayed would signal to her father that this was performance rather than confession, that his life depended on playing along with whatever story she was about to construct. "The one you made me promise never to mention, even under the worst circumstances." Thomas Manning's eyes widened in genuine confusion, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he might contradict her story before understanding what she needed from him. But her father had survived 58 years in a harsh world by being smart as well as stubborn, and she could see the moment when comprehension dawned in his expression. His shoulders straightened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who decided to trust his daughter's judgment even when he didn't understand her reasoning. "Sarah," he said carefully, "we agreed that information was meant to stay in the family. These are dangerous times to be discussing such matters with outsiders." He glanced at Blackwood with the wary expression of a man who'd learned not to trust authority figures, then back at his daughter. "But I suppose if you feel the circumstances warrant it. He let the sentence trail off, leaving room for her to fill in the details of whatever desperate plan she'd concocted. Blackwood's grip on her arm tightened as he stepped forward, his pale eyes burning with barely contained greed. "Miss Manning has been telling me about your family's financial preparations for uncertain times. I think it would be in everyone's best interest if we could examine these resources and determine whether they might help resolve the tax situation we discussed yesterday." His voice carried the tone of a man trying to sound reasonable while making threats, and Sierra could see her father's jaw clench as he recognized the coercion behind the polite words. "I don't know what Sierra has told you," Thomas said slowly, "but our family's private arrangements are hardly the business of territorial officials. If there's some question about our tax obligations, I'm sure we can resolve it through proper legal channels." He was stalling, buying time while he tried to understand the game his daughter was playing, but Sierra could see the dangerous gleam in Blackwood's eyes as his patience began to fray. "Papa," she said urgently, "Sheriff Blackwood has explained that the tax situation is more serious than we thought. If we can show him the emergency funds you've been saving, he might be able to help us resolve this matter without involving the territorial inspector." She moved closer to her father, using her body to partially block Blackwood's view as she mouthed the words, "play along," with desperate intensity. "Please. Our family's future depends on it." Thomas Manning studied his daughter's face with the intensity of a man reading a map in hostile territory, searching for the landmarks that would guide him safely through unknown dangers. "Whatever." had happened to her during the night in the Badlands had changed something fundamental in her expression. There was a hardness there that hadn't existed before, a steel core that had been forged in the fire of desperate circumstances. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd made his decision. "Very well," he said, moving toward the back room with deliberate slowness. "But I want it understood that this is being done under protest, and only because my daughter seems to believe it's necessary." He paused at the doorway and looked back at Blackwood with undisguised hatred. "The arrangement I made was meant to protect my family from exactly this kind of official interest. I hope you understand the trust that's being placed in your discretion." "Of course, Mr. Manning," Blackwood replied smoothly. But Sierra could see the predatory satisfaction in his expression. "You have my word that this information will be handled with the utmost confidentiality." He gestured to his deputies, who began positioning themselves around the store with the casual efficiency of men who'd done this dance many times before. "Deputy Drummond, I want you to watch the front door. Nobody enters or leaves until our business is concluded." The back room of the store was cramped and cluttered with the accumulated detritus of 15 years in business. Empty crates, outdated inventory, and the small personal items that marked this place as home as well as workplace. Thomas moved to a corner where several flour barrels stood in neat rows, their contents long since consumed, and their wooden shells repurposed for storage. He selected one of the middle barrels and began working at its lid with a pry bar, his movements careful and deliberate. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly as he worked, his voice pitched low enough that only Sierra and Blackwood could hear. "This money wasn't meant to be found. It was meant to be insurance, a way to rebuild if everything else was lost." The lid came free with a soft pop, and he reached inside to withdraw a small canvas bag that clinked with the unmistakable sound of metal coins. "I've been saving for 20 years, putting aside every spare coin I could manage." Blackwood's eyes widened as Thomas poured a stream of gold eagles into his palm, the coins catching the lamplight and throwing back reflections that danced across the sheriff's face like flickering flames. There were perhaps 30 coins visible, more than enough to validate Sierra's story about hidden wealth, but not nearly enough to satisfy the greed she could see burning in Blackwood's expression. "This is just the beginning," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his performance. "I've been careful to spread the risk, hiding portions in different locations around the store, and even in some external sites. Old habits from my days in the California goldfields, where a man learned not to put all his eggs in one basket." He held up one of the coins, turning it so the light caught the eagle's wings. "Each cache contains between 50 and 100 coins, depending on how much I could accumulate, before I felt it was time to establish a new hiding place." Sierra watched her father's performance with a mixture of admiration and terror, marveling at how quickly he'd grasped the essentials of her deception and begun to elaborate on it with convincing details. But she also knew that every word he spoke was digging them deeper into a hole that would be impossible to climb out of when Blackwood discovered the truth. The gold coins were real, she could see that much, but she doubted there were enough of them to satisfy the sheriff's expanded expectations. "How much?" Blackwood asked, his voice tight with barely controlled excitement. "How much total are we talking about?" He was already calculating, she could see, planning how to use this unexpected windfall to expand his power and influence. "Because if we're discussing the kind of money that could make a real difference in a man's circumstances, then I think we need to have a more detailed conversation about how this information gets handled." "Between $3,000 and $4,000, Thomas said carefully, choosing numbers that echoed his daughter's earlier claims while leaving room for negotiation. "Perhaps more, depending on the current value of gold in the territorial markets. I haven't had it professionally appraised for obvious reasons." He returned the coins to their bag and sealed it with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd performed this ritual many times, but I think you'll find it more than sufficient to resolve any questions about our tax obligations. Indeed, Blackwood murmured, but Sierra could see the wheels turning behind his pale eyes. $3,000 was the exact amount he'd claimed the Manning family owed in back taxes, which meant that acquiring this gold would solve his immediate problem while leaving him with a substantial bonus for his trouble. However, I think we need to discuss the logistics of this arrangement. Moving that much gold requires careful planning, and I want to ensure that nothing goes wrong during the transfer. What kind of logistics? Sierra asked, though she dreaded the answer. She'd hoped that revealing the existence of the gold would be enough to buy her father's safety and perhaps even their freedom. But she was beginning to understand that Blackwood's greed was a bottomless pit that would never be fully satisfied. Surely we can simply retrieve the money and settle our accounts like civilized people. Oh, my dear Miss Manning. Blackwood's smile was sharp and predatory. I'm afraid it's not quite that simple. You see, moving large amounts of gold requires special precautions, particularly when we're dealing with unofficial arrangements. I'll need to verify the locations of all the caches, ensure that the gold is genuine, and make arrangements for secure transport. He paused, letting the implications of his words sink in. This is going to require several days of careful work, and I'm going to need both of you to remain available for consultation throughout the process. Thomas Manning's face went pale as he realized the trap they'd walked into. You're talking about keeping us under some kind of custody arrangement. That wasn't part of any agreement I made with my daughter. His voice carried the edge of a man who'd been pushed too far, and Sierra could see the dangerous tension building in his shoulders. I won't be held prisoner in my own store while you ransack my life savings. Nobody's talking about prisoners, Blackwood said smoothly, but his hand moved instinctively toward his gun butt. I'm talking about protective custody, ensuring that nothing happens to valuable witnesses while we resolve this delicate situation. After all, there are other people in this town who might be very interested in learning about your family's hidden resources. He gestured toward the front of the store, where the sounds of normal life continued despite the drama unfolding in the back room. I'm sure you wouldn't want word of this gold to reach the wrong ears. The threat was clear enough. Cooperate or face the consequences of having their secret exposed to every desperado and claim jumper in the territory. Sierra felt the walls closing in around them as she realized how thoroughly Blackwood had anticipated her desperate gambit. He'd turned her attempt to buy their freedom into a new form of slavery, one that would last until he'd extracted every ounce of gold from their hiding places and probably kill them afterward to ensure their silence. There's something else we need to discuss, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man revealing his final cards. The matter of Miss Manning's education and the responsibilities that come with her new circumstances. He turned to face her directly, his pale eyes burning with the same predatory hunger she'd seen in the cabin. You see, I've decided that our arrangement from last night still stands. Regardless of these new financial considerations, that wasn't part of the deal, Sierra protested, her voice cracking with the strain of maintaining her composure. I told you about the gold so that you'd leave my family alone. That was the bargain we made. But even as she spoke, she could see the futility of appealing to his honor. Blackwood had never intended to keep any promises he'd made. He'd simply been maneuvering her into a position where she had no choice but to surrender everything he wanted. The deal was that I wouldn't hurt your father, and that I'd let you both leave town alive after I had the gold, Blackwood corrected with the precision of a lawyer reading a contract. I never said anything about altering our other arrangements. In fact, I think you'll find that having access to your family's resources makes you an even more valuable ... companion. His smile was cold and calculating. A woman with gold is worth considerably more than a woman without it. Thomas Manning stepped forward, his face flushed with rage and his hands clenched into fists. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, his voice carrying the fury of a man who'd been pushed beyond his breaking point. "You think you can just take everything from us? My daughter, my savings, my life's work?" He was reaching for something behind the counter, and Sierra realized with horror that he was going for the shotgun he kept for protection against robbers. "Papa, no!" She cried out, but it was too late. The sound of steel sliding on steel filled the air as Deputy Drummond drew his revolver with the practiced speed of a man who'd killed before. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space, and Thomas Manning stumbled backward with a look of surprise on his face, his hand pressed to the spreading red stain on his chest. "Stupid old man," Blackwood said calmly, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than watching a man die. "I tried to do this the civilized way, but you people insist on making things difficult." He stepped over Thomas's body without a second glance and moved toward Sierra, who was kneeling beside her father in a pool of spreading blood. "Now then, Miss Manning, shall we discuss the new terms of our arrangement?" Sierra held her father's hand as the life drained out of his eyes, feeling the last tremors of his heartbeat against her palm like the wings of a dying bird. His lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words of love or comfort, or perhaps simple apology for the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. But no sound emerged, only the wet rattle of breath passing through damaged lungs, and then even that stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt like the end of the world. "The gold." "Miss Manning," Blackwood said, his voice cutting through her grief like a blade. "I'm afraid I'm going to need you to show me where it's hidden. All of it, not just the little sample your father provided." He crouched beside her, his pale eyes studying her face with the detached interest of a scientist examining a specimen. "And I want you to understand that any further attempts at deception will result in consequences that make your father's death look like a mercy. There is no gold," Sierra said quietly, her voice hollow with loss and exhaustion. "I made it all up. There are maybe 50 coins in that barrel, and that's everything we have." She looked up at him with eyes that no longer held fear, only the terrible clarity that comes when a person has lost everything they had to lose. "I thought if I could convince you we had money, you might let us buy our way out of this nightmare. But there's no treasure, no hidden caches, no secret fortune. Just a dying store, and a dead father, and a fool of a daughter who thought she could outsmart the devil himself." Blackwood's expression shifted through several emotions as he processed her confession: surprise, then fury, then something that might have been admiration for the audacity of her deception. "You lying little bitch," he said finally, but there was almost a note of respect in his voice. "You actually had me believing that your pathetic family had managed to accumulate that kind of wealth." He stood up slowly, his hand resting on his gun butt as he considered his options. "Well, Miss Manning, I suppose this means we're back to our original arrangement." "No," Sierra said, rising to her feet with the slow deliberation of someone who'd made a final decision. "I'm done playing your games. I'm done pretending that there's any way out of this that doesn't end with my destruction." She stepped over her father's body and moved toward the front door, her movements calm and purposeful despite the tears streaming down her face. "If you want to kill me, then do it, but I won't be your victim anymore." "Stop right there," Blackwood ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. "You don't get to decide when this ends. You don't get to choose the terms of your surrender." He nodded to his deputies, who moved to block the doorway with their hands on their weapons. "You're going to come with me, and you're going to fulfill the bargain we made, whether you want to or not." "The bargain was based on a lie," Sierra replied, continuing her slow march toward the door. "Everything I told you was false. There's no gold, no hidden treasure, no way for you to profit from my family's misfortune except by taking what you've always wanted to take." She paused just out of arm's reach of the nearest deputy. "So take it. But know that you're getting nothing more than the body of a broken woman who's already dead inside." The confrontation might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the sound of shouting from the street outside. Through the store's front window, Sarah could see a crowd gathering, their voices rising in excitement and alarm as word spread about the gunshot that had echoed through the normally quiet morning. Mrs. Henderson was there, along with several other townspeople, whose faces showed the mixture of curiosity and dread that came with witnessing someone else's tragedy. "Disperse them," Blackwood ordered Deputy Drummond, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. "Tell them there's been an accident, that everything is under control." But even as he spoke, more people were joining the crowd, and Sarah could see the problem from his perspective. Too many witnesses, too many questions, too much attention focused on his activities. "Sheriff." Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the morning air like a bell. "Is everyone all right in there? We heard shooting." She was pressed against the store's front window, her hands cupped around her eyes as she tried to peer through the glass. "Is Thomas hurt? Where's Sarah?" Her questions were echoed by other voices in the crowd, creating a chorus of concern that made it impossible to ignore the situation. Blackwood's jaw clenched as he realized how completely his plans had been derailed. Killing Thomas Manning in private was one thing. Explaining the death to a crowd of concerned citizens was another matter entirely. And with Sarah's confession that there was no gold to be found, he was left with nothing but a dead storekeeper. And a witness who could testify to his crimes. "New plan," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only his men could hear. "We're going to walk out of here nice and calm, and we're going to tell these people that Thomas Manning attacked a law officer and was shot in self-defense. Miss Manning is being taken into protective custody for her own safety." He turned to face her, his pale eyes burning with frustrated rage. "And you're going to corroborate every word of that story, or I'll make sure that some of these concerned citizens join your father in the grave." But Sarah was no longer listening to his threats. She was looking past him, through the crowd of townspeople, to where a lone figure sat motionless on horseback at the edge of the gathering. The man was clearly not from Deadwood Gulch. His clothes were buckskin and cloth rather than the wool and cotton favored by the town's residents, and his long black hair was braided with feathers and beads that caught the morning sunlight. Most telling of all, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who belonged to the land itself, rather than to the artificial structures that white men had imposed upon it. Their eyes met across the chaos of the crowd, and Sarah felt something pass between them, not recognition, exactly, but a kind of understanding that transcended the barriers of race and culture. The man's face was impassive, but she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he was cataloging every detail of the scene before him with the careful attention of someone who understood that information could mean the difference between life and death. "Time to go," Blackwood said, grabbing her arm with enough force to leave bruises. "You're going to walk out there and smile and tell these people that everything is fine. And then you're going to come with me, and we're going to finish what we started." His grip tightened as he began dragging her toward the door. "Unless you want to see how many of your neighbors I can kill before they manage to stop me." The crowd pressed closer to Manning's general store as Blackwood emerged with Sarah's arm locked in his iron grip, her torn dress and blood-stained hands telling a story that needed no words. Mrs. Henderson gasped and stepped backward, her face pale with shock as she took in the scene before her. The sheriff's disheveled appearance, the deputy's nervous alertness, and most damning of all, the crimson stains that marked Sarah's clothing like accusations written in her father's blood. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the dusty street, turning the gathering into a tableau of frontier justice gone wrong. Thomas Manning attacked a law officer in the performance of his duties, Blackwood announced to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent years making lies sound like truth. He was shot in self-defense when he attempted to use a weapon against Deputy Drummond here. He gestured toward his subordinate, who nodded grimly and kept his hand near his gun butt. "Miss Manning is being taken into protective custody for her own safety while we investigate the circumstances surrounding her father's unfortunate decision. But the crowd wasn't buying the sheriff's carefully constructed story. These people had known Thomas Manning for 15 years, had watched him build his business through honest work and fair dealing. The idea that he would suddenly turn violent against law enforcement officers strained credibility beyond the breaking point. Murmurs of dissent rippled through the gathering like wind through wheat, and Sarah could see the doubt and suspicion growing in their faces. "That's not what happened," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air, despite its soft tone. "My father never attacked anyone. He was murdered in cold blood for refusing to let Sheriff Blackwood steal our savings." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, and she could feel the crowd's attention focus on her with laser intensity. "Everything the sheriff has told you is a lie." Blackwood's grip on her arm tightened until she gasped with pain, but she didn't try to pull away. "Miss Manning is clearly distraught by her father's death," he said smoothly, but she could hear the edge of desperation creeping into his voice. "Grief can make people say things they don't mean, create false memories of traumatic events." He began moving toward his horse, dragging her along despite her resistance. "I'm sure once she's had time to process what happened, she'll remember the events more clearly. Let her go." The voice came from somewhere in the crowd, followed by other shouts of agreement. "We want to hear what she has to say." The townspeople were beginning to surge forward, their collective anger overcoming their individual fear of the sheriff's authority. "You can't just drag her off like some common criminal." But Blackwood's deputies had drawn their weapons, creating a corridor of intimidation that kept the crowd at bay from his position at the edge of the gathering. Mato Najin watched the unfolding drama with the patient attention of a hunter studying his prey. The white man's words carried the stench of deception, and the woman's pain was written in every line of her body like scars carved by a cruel knife. He had come to Deadwood Gulch to trade for supplies, but what he found instead was a scene that reminded him why his people had learned to distrust the Wizichu and their twisted version of justice. The woman's eyes met his again across the chaos of the crowd, and he saw something there that made his warrior's heart clench with recognition. It was the look of someone who had been hunted beyond endurance, who had reached the point where death seemed preferable to continued suffering. He had seen that same expression on the faces of his own people during the long winter after the soldiers had burned their village, when survival required a kind of strength that few possessed. Mato Najin's horse, a paint stallion named Thunderwind, shifted restlessly beneath him as if sensing his rider's growing tension. The animal's ears were pricked forward, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of violence that hung over the town like a storm cloud. The warrior's hand moved instinctively to the tomahawk at his belt, his fingers tracing the familiar weight of the weapon his grandfather had carried in the old wars. "You people need to disperse," Deputy Drummond called out, his voice cracking with nervous authority. "This is official business, and you're interfering with a lawful arrest." But his words only served to inflame the crowd further, and Mato Najin could see the situation spiraling toward violence with the inevitability of a rockslide. "Anyone who doesn't clear the street in the next minute will be subject to arrest for obstruction of justice." "What justice?" Mrs. Henderson demanded, her voice shrill with indignation. "You murdered Tom Manning in his own store, and now you want to drag his daughter off to God knows where." She turned to address the crowd directly, her arms spread wide in a gesture of appeal. "Are we going to stand here and let this happen? Are we going to let corruption and murder rule our town?" Her words struck a chord with the gathering, and Mato Najin could see the mood shifting from fear to fury. Blackwood must have sensed the change in the crowd's temperament, because his movements became more urgent as he tried to reach his horse. But Sarah had stopped cooperating, her legs going limp as she forced him to drag her dead weight across the dusty street. The sight of a woman being manhandled by an armed man proved to be the final catalyst the crowd needed to overcome their fear Enough. Reverend Carter's voice boomed across the square with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding attention. In the name of Christian decency, I demand that you release Miss Manning immediately. The elderly preacher pushed through the crowd. With his Bible clutched in his hands like a shield, his face flushed with righteous anger. Whatever crimes you believe have been committed, they don't justify this brutality. Stay back, preacher, Blackwood snarled, drawing his gun with his free hand while maintaining his grip on Sierra's arm. This is official business, and I won't have civilians interfering with the law. But his weapon only served to galvanize the crowd further, and Mato Najin could see several men reaching for their own guns in response to the threat. It was then that the Lakota warrior made his decision. With a movement so fluid, it seemed like water flowing over stone, he dismounted from Thunderwind and began walking through the crowd toward the confrontation. People parted before him instinctively, recognizing something in his bearing that commanded respect even from those who might normally view him with suspicion. His moccasins made no sound on the dusty ground, and his presence seemed to create a bubble of calm in the chaos. You, Blackwood said, noticing the approaching warrior for the first time. This doesn't concern you, Indian. I suggest you get back on your horse and ride out of town before you find yourself in more trouble than you can handle. But there was something in Mato Najin's eyes that made the sheriff's voice falter. A quiet strength that spoke of a man who had faced death many times and emerged victorious. Mato Najin stopped just out of arm's reach, his dark eyes fixed on Blackwood's face with the unwavering intensity of a hawk studying a mouse. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly in the suddenly quiet street. The woman does not want to go with you. His English was accented but precise, each word chosen with care. Perhaps you should listen to what she has to say. What she has to say is none of your damn business, Blackwood replied, but Sierra could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. This is a matter for white law, not savage interference. He tried to back toward his horse, but the crowd had closed in around them, creating a human wall that blocked his escape routes. Deputy Drummond, arrest this man for obstruction of justice. But Drummond seemed reluctant to take action against the warrior, perhaps sensing the same dangerous calm that had made Blackwood hesitate. Mato Najin stood perfectly still, his hands empty but ready, his entire bearing suggesting a man who could explode into violence at a moment's notice. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how the confrontation would resolve itself. I have seen this before, Mato Najin said quietly, his eyes never leaving Blackwood's face. Men who use their power to hurt those who cannot defend themselves. Men who hide behind laws that exist only to serve their own desires. He took a single step forward, and the sheriff actually flinched at the movement. In my people's way, such men are called cowards. They are not worthy of the name warrior. You don't understand the situation, Blackwood protested, but his voice lacked conviction. This woman is a criminal, wanted for questioning in connection with her father's death. I'm simply doing my job, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears, and Sierra could see the doubt beginning to creep into his deputy's expressions. Then let her speak, Mato Najin said simply. Let the people hear her words and judge for themselves what kind of truth you offer. He gestured toward the crowd with an open palm. If your law is just, it will not fear the light of day. If your actions are honorable, they will not require force to be accepted. The challenge hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Blackwood's face cycled through several emotions, fury, fear, calculation, before settling on a cold mask of authority. Very well, he said finally. Miss Manning, you have 1 minute to address these good people. But remember that anything you say will be taken as evidence in the official investigation of your father's death. Sierra felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. Every person in the crowd was watching her, waiting for her to either validate or destroy the sheriff's version of events. But more than that, she was aware of the warrior's presence beside her, his quiet strength offering her the courage to speak truth in the face of power. "My father was murdered," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Not because he attacked anyone, but because he refused to let Sheriff Blackwood steal our savings and turn me into his personal property. Everything you've heard is a lie designed to cover up corruption and abuse of power." The words came pouring out like water from a broken dam, carrying with them all the pain and fury she'd been forced to suppress. This man is not a lawman. He's a predator who uses his badge to victimize innocent people. The crowd erupted in angry shouts, their voices rising in a cacophony of outrage that echoed off the buildings surrounding the square. Blackwood's face went pale as he realized that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling before his eyes. But it was too late to retreat now. The truth had been spoken, and the people of Deadwood Gulch would never look at their sheriff the same way again. The only question now was whether justice would be done, or whether corruption would triumph through force of arms. The moment stretched like a bowstring about to snap, with 43 townspeople facing down 3 armed men in a contest of wills that would determine the soul of Deadwood Gulch. Blackwood's deputies had positioned themselves with military precision, their weapons drawn and pointed at the crowd, but Sierra could see the uncertainty in their eyes as they faced friends and neighbors who had suddenly become their enemies. These were not faceless strangers to be intimidated. These were people who knew their wives, bought from their businesses, sat beside them in church on Sundays. "You're all making a terrible mistake," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the desperate authority of a man watching his world collapse around him. "Miss Manning is clearly unbalanced by grief, and you're allowing her delusions to cloud your judgment." He gestured toward Sierra with his gun barrel, the weapon trembling slightly in his grip. "I've served this town faithfully for 8 years. Protected you from claim jumpers and desperados. Maintained order when chaos threatened to consume everything you've built. You've been a plague on this town." Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through his protests like a blade through silk. "We've all seen how you operate, how you use your badge to line your own pockets while decent people suffer." She turned to address the crowd directly, her face flushed with righteous anger. "How many of us have had to pay his special taxes? How many businesses have been forced to close because they couldn't afford his protection?" Her words struck home, and Sierra could see heads nodding throughout the gathering. Mato Najin remained perfectly still beside her, his presence like a boulder in a rushing stream, immovable, eternal, offering stability in the chaos that swirled around them. But she could sense the coiled tension in his body, the way his weight was balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to explode into action at the first sign of violence. His dark eyes never left Blackwood's face, reading the sheriff's expressions. Like a hunter tracking wounded prey through unfamiliar territory. "Deputy Drummond," Blackwood snapped, his voice cracking with stress. "I'm ordering you to disperse this crowd. Use whatever force is necessary to restore order." But his subordinate hesitated, the weapon wavering in his grip as he looked out at faces he'd known for years. "That's a direct order, Deputy. If you refuse to obey, you'll be charged with dereliction of duty. Maybe it's time we talked about duty," Drummond said quietly, his voice carrying a note of steel that surprised everyone present. "Maybe it's time we talked about what we signed up for when we pinned on these badges." He lowered his weapon slightly, and Sierra could see the decision forming in his eyes. "I took an oath to protect and serve the people of this town, not to help you terrorize them." Blackwood's face went white with rage as he realized that his carefully constructed empire of fear was crumbling before his eyes. "You traitorous bastard," he snarled, swinging his gun toward his former deputy. "I made you what you are. I gave you power, position, respect." But his words were cut off as the crowd surged forward, their collective courage finally overcoming their individual fear. It was then that everything exploded into chaos. Blackwood's finger tightened on the trigger, aiming for the center of the advancing crowd. But Mato Najin moved with the fluid grace of a striking snake. His tomahawk left his belt and flew through the air in a perfect arc, the polished steel, catching the morning sunlight before embedding itself in the sheriff's shoulder with a wet thud that silenced the entire square. Blackwood's scream of pain and rage echoed off the surrounding buildings as he stumbled backward, his gun falling from nerveless fingers to clatter on the dusty ground. Blood spread across his shirt like spilled wine, and his face contorted with agony and disbelief. You savage," he gasped, pressing his left hand against the wound. "You've signed your own death warrant." But Mato Najin was already moving, crossing the space between them with the silent efficiency of a hunting cat. His hand closed around the tomahawk's handle, and with a single smooth motion, he wrenched the weapon free from Blackwood's shoulder. The sheriff collapsed to his knees, his face gray with shock and blood loss, while the warrior stood over him like an avenging spirit. "In my people's way," Mato Najin said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "A man who preys on the weak is no man at all. He is a sick animal that must be put down for the good of the tribe." He raised the tomahawk, its blade gleaming with Blackwood's blood, and for a moment, Sarah thought she was about to witness an execution. "Wait," she said, her voice stopping the warrior's hand in mid-swing. "He's not worth the stain on your weapon." She moved closer, looking down at the man who had destroyed her family and nearly destroyed her soul. Let him live with the knowledge that he was brought down by a woman he tried to break and a savage he considered beneath his notice. The crowd had formed a circle around the fallen sheriff, their faces showing a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty as they processed what had just happened. For 8 years, this man had ruled their lives through fear and intimidation, and now he knelt before them, broken and bleeding, stripped of the authority that had made him seem invincible. But with his power gone, they were faced with the question of what came next. "String him up," someone called out from the back of the crowd. "He's a murderer and a thief. Let's finish this properly." The suggestion was taken up by other voices, and Sarah could see the mood shifting from justice to vengeance with the speed of a prairie fire. "We've got rope at the livery stable. Won't take but a minute to rig a proper noose." "No," Mato Najin said firmly, his voice cutting through the growing bloodlust like a clear bell. "That is not the way of justice. That is the way of the mob." He gestured toward the wounded sheriff with his tomahawk. "This man has committed crimes against your people. Let your people judge him according to your laws, not according to your anger." Reverend Carter stepped forward, his Bible still clutched in his hands like a talisman against the violence that threatened to consume them all. "The warrior speaks. Wisdom," he said, his voice carrying the moral authority of a man who had spent his life studying the difference between justice and revenge. "We are not animals to be driven by our basest instincts. We are civilized people, and we must act as such." "Civilized?" Mrs. Henderson's voice carried a note of bitter laughter. Was it civilized when he murdered Tom Manning in cold blood? Was it civilized when he tried to force himself on an innocent young woman? She pointed an accusing finger at the kneeling sheriff. "Some men forfeit their right to civilized treatment when they abandon civilization themselves." But Deputy Drummond had retrieved his superior's fallen weapon and was now standing guard over the wounded man, his face grim with determination. "Mrs. Henderson's right about his crimes," he said quietly. "But the preacher's right about how we handle them. We'll take him to the territorial capital. Let him stand trial before a proper judge and jury." He looked around at the crowd, his eyes meeting each face in turn. "That's how we prove we're better than he is. What about his other crimes?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the weight of personal grief and determination. "What about the people he's terrorized over the years, the businesses he's destroyed, the lives he's ruined?" She gestured toward the general store where her father's body still lay. "How do we get justice for all of that?" "We rebuild," Mato Najin said simply. We take what was broken and make it whole again. We remember the dead by living better lives than those who killed them. He cleaned his tomahawk on his buckskin shirt and returned it to his belt with practiced efficiency. Revenge is a poison that kills the one who drinks it. Justice is medicine that heals the whole community. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people drifting back to their daily lives with the stunned expressions of those who had witnessed something that would change their town forever. But several men remained behind to help Deputy Drummond secure the wounded sheriff, while others began making plans for the immediate future, electing a new sheriff, establishing a town council, creating the democratic structures that Blackwood had systematically destroyed. "What will you do now?" Mato Najin asked Sira as they stood together in the emptying square. "Your father is dead, your home is destroyed, your life as you knew it is finished." His words might have sounded harsh from another man, but his tone carried only compassion and understanding. "Where will you go? What will you become?" Sira looked around at the town that had been her home for as long as she could remember, at the faces of people who had known her since childhood, at the store where she had learned to count and read and dream of a future that now seemed impossible. Everything familiar had been stripped away, leaving her adrift in a world that suddenly seemed vast and terrifying. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought beyond this moment, beyond surviving long enough to see him brought to justice." She turned to look at the warrior, this stranger who had risked his life to help her when her own people had been too afraid to act. "Why did you help me? You don't know me, don't owe me anything." "Because it was right," Mato Najin said simply. "Because in the old stories, the spirits test us by sending those who need our help. If we fail the test, we become less than we were before." He paused, studying her face with the intensity of a man reading a sacred text. "And because I saw in you the same fire that burns in the hearts of my people when they face impossible odds. Come with me," he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. "My people live in the sacred lands to the north, where the white man's law holds no power. You could start a new life there, learn new ways of being in the world." He gestured toward his paint stallion, which stood patiently waiting at the edge of the square. "It would not be easy, but it would be honest. And honesty is the only foundation on which a true life can be built." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning a vast chasm. Sira felt the pull of the familiar warring with the promise of the unknown, the safety of the predictable battling against the adventure of the untested. But as she looked around at the ruins of her old life, she realized that staying would mean living as a ghost, haunted by memories of what had been lost. "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger than she had expected. "Yes, I'll come with you." She took a step toward the horse, then paused. "But first, I need to bury my father. I need to say goodbye to the life I'm leaving behind." Mato Najin nodded, understanding flickering in his dark eyes. "We will do what honor requires," he said simply. "And then we will ride toward the sunrise, toward a future that neither of us can imagine, but both of us must embrace." 6 months had passed since the day Serafina Manning died in the dusty streets of Deadwood Gulch, and in her place stood a woman the Lakota called Wikapi Najin Standing, star-named for the way she had stood firm against the darkness that had tried to consume her. The morning sun painted the rolling hills of the sacred lands in shades of gold and amber, while the Powder River wound its way through the valley like a silver ribbon, carrying the stories of all who had lived and died. Along its banks, she knelt beside the river, her hands working the soft doeskin with the patient rhythm her adopted grandmother, Winona, had taught her during the long winter months. The buckskin dress she wore was decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her journey from the white world to this place of healing, each pattern a chapter in the narrative of her transformation from victim to survivor to something entirely new. "Your stitching grows stronger each day," Winona said. settling beside her with the careful movements of a woman who had seen 80 winters. Soon you will be ready to make the wedding dress that will carry you into your new life. The old woman's fingers traced the delicate patterns on Sierra's work, her touch as light as butterfly wings on morning flowers. But first, you must decide if your heart is truly ready for such a step. I dream of him sometimes, Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Not Mato Najin, but the other one. The one who destroyed everything I thought I knew about the world. She set down her work and stared out across the river, watching the way the current carved new channels through the ancient rock. I wake up feeling like his hands are still on me, like his voice is still in my head telling me what I'm worth. Winona nodded with the understanding of a woman who had lived through the cavalry attacks on their village, who had watched her own husband die defending their people from soldiers who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. The wounds of the spirit heal slowly, she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned to carry pain without being destroyed by it. But they do heal, if we have the courage to let them. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Sierra looked up to see a group of young warriors riding toward the river with the easy confidence of men who had been born to this life. At their head rode Tatanka Iotanka sitting, Bull's nephew, a man whose reputation for courage in battle was matched only by his skill with horses. Winona, grandmother, Tatanka called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the formal respect due to an elder. We bring word from the council. The Wasichu soldiers are moving toward our winter camp. They say they come in peace, but their scouts carry repeating rifles, and their supply wagons are loaded with ammunition. He glanced at Sierra, his expression neutral but watchful. The council must decide whether to fight or flee, and all voices must be heard. Including mine? Sierra asked, rising to her feet with the fluid grace she had learned from months of riding and working alongside the Lakota women. I am still Wasichu, despite the name you have given me. My voice carries the weight of my people's crimes. She met Tatanka's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his war paint or his reputation. Would the council truly want to hear what I have to say? The council will hear all voices, Tatanka replied, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. Though some may question whether one who has lived among us for only 6 moons can truly understand the weight of the choices we face. The council lodge was filled with the smoke of sweetgrass and sage, the sacred herbs creating a haze that seemed to blur the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. Sierra sat in the circle of women, her hands folded in her lap as she listened to the voices that would determine the fate of everyone she had come to love. The Wasichu speak with forked tongues, declared Desunka Witko, crazy horse, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never known defeat in battle. They promise peace while they load their guns. They speak of friendship while they steal our hunting grounds. He gestured toward the entrance of the lodge, where the sound of children playing could be heard like music from another world. How many times must we trust their words before we accept that they have no words worth trusting? But Mato Najin rose to his feet, his voice calm and measured as he addressed the council. My brothers, I do not speak for peace because I fear war. I speak for wisdom because I have seen what happens when we choose the path of violence without considering all consequences. He looked around the circle, his eyes meeting each face in turn. We are strong, but we are not stronger than the entire white nation. We are brave, but bravery without wisdom is just another form of suicide. And what does the white woman say? The voice came from the back of the lodge, carrying a challenge that made every head turn. She who has lived among us but was born among our enemies. Does she counsel us to trust the soldiers who come with guns in their hands and lies on their lips? The speaker was Wambly Gleska Spotted, Eagle, a war chief whose hatred for the Wasichu was legendary among his people. Sierra felt the weight of every gaze in the lodge pressing down on her like a physical force. For 6 months, She had been preparing for this moment without knowing it, learning not just the language and customs of the Lakota, but the deeper truths that governed their relationship with the world. When she spoke, her voice carried the strength of someone who had found her true name. "I know the soldiers you speak of," she said, rising to her feet with the dignity that Winona had taught her. "I have seen how they use their laws to justify their crimes, how they twist justice into a weapon against the innocent." She looked around the circle, meeting each gaze with steady eyes. "But I also know that running from them will not save. U.S. They will follow us to the ends of the earth, because they believe this land belongs to them by right of conquest. Then what do you counsel?" Tasunka Witko asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than mockery. "If we cannot trust their peace and cannot outrun their war, what path remains for the people?" "We make them see us as people rather than obstacles," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "We force them to confront the reality of what they are asking us to sacrifice. We bring their women and children to see our women and children. We show them that we laugh and cry and dream just as they do." She paused, gathering her thoughts like a hunter gathering arrows for a crucial shot. "The soldiers who come here are not evil men, they are ignorant men, doing what they believe is right, because no one has ever shown them another way. You speak of showing them our humanity," Wandli Gleska said, his voice heavy with skepticism. "But what of the times we have tried this approach? What of the treaties they have broken, the promises they have forgotten? Until we succeed," Sira replied simply. "Because the alternative is the destruction of everything we hold sacred. If we choose war, we may win battles, but we will lose the war. If we choose to run, we may escape today, but our children will face the same choice tomorrow." She looked around the circle, her eyes lingering on the faces of the women who had become her sisters. "But if we choose to stand and speak truth, we may plant seeds that will grow into understanding." Mato Najin's eyes met hers across the circle, and she saw in them the same recognition that had passed between them that first day in Deadwood Gulch. This was not the broken woman who had been cast into the Badlands to die, but someone who had learned to transform her pain into wisdom, her fear into courage, her isolation into connection with something greater than herself. The council voted, and the vote was closer than anyone had expected. But in the end, wisdom prevailed over anger, hope over despair, and the people chose to meet the soldiers with open hands and honest words, rather than drawn weapons and war cries. It was a choice that would define not only their immediate future, but the legacy they would leave for the generations yet to come. As the sun set over the sacred lands, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded Sira of the colors she had once woven into her father's store, she stood beside Mato Najin on the hill overlooking their camp. Below them, the people were preparing for the challenges that lay ahead, sharpening their words as carefully as they had once sharpened their weapons. "Do you think it will work?" she asked, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who had learned that hope was both the most dangerous and the most necessary of human emotions. "Do you think we can really change hearts that have been hardened by generations of hatred and fear?" "I think we have to try," he replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Because the alternative is unthinkable. Because you have shown me that even the most broken things can be made whole again if we have the courage to believe in healing." He turned to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of day. "And because I have seen what happens when one person decides to stand for truth instead of surrendering to lies." The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Sira thought of the name the people had given her, Standing Star. It was a name that carried both honor and responsibility, a reminder that she had chosen to be a light in the darkness rather than another shadow in the night. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it not as Serafina Manning, the broken victim of corrupt power, but as Wikapi Najin, the woman who had learned to stand firm against the storms that threatened to destroy all she held dear.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.